From Alabama, we head to Oklahoma and we catch up with Oklahoma State University's cropping system specialist, Dr. Josh Lofton. Josh, let's take a look at the soybean crop of 23 across Oklahoma.
Yeah, I mean we're getting the last acres kind of in the bin. I think for the most part we're done across the state. We might have some really late double crop acres that are still out there, but for the most part we're pretty much in. And it's been a mixed year. Of course it was a very dry year for us for the bulk majority of the summer, and so that caused some issues. Just like any other year in Oklahoma, it really depended on what mile marker you had your farm to determine how well you yielded based on if you got that pop-up rain shower or you didn't. We have some of our producers across the state are reporting very nice yields, particularly of the later planted. So our double crop or just the later planted soybean systems are doing a little bit better, a little fairer across. Even some of our growers that planted full season, so that April or May planted soybeans, they didn't produce anything. They hayed up the crop and took it out before we even got to the end of the season. So it's been very similar to what you would remember the 2022 on, although we are getting better. That later crop, that double crop or that later planted soybean does hold some promise to us, and we've seen some really nice yields from those.
Why does it seem that a double crop seems to work better than a full season crop in your state?
Yeah, so in Oklahoma, in soybean in general, the whole intent is to try to match good rainfall with some moderate temperatures during the most critical stages of soybean production. So we're talking about flowering, post-flowering into pod development and into seed fill. And so in Oklahoma, if we plant in April and we really hit into a rough July, that's when we really start seeing pod fill and seed fill really start ramping up, especially that later into July, first part of August. And that in Oklahoma it can be our hottest and our driest periods. And this year, depending on where you were, that was a hot and dry period. The thing that really got us this year, though, Dave, is that September. We had September record high temperatures. We had temperatures well into the hundreds throughout August into September, and that really took a lot of our normal season or that early planted, that April and May planted systems, that took them down a peg, or it made them to where they didn't even yield. Where our double crop systems didn't even start going to reproductive until that later part of September into October. And so we got a lot more favorable conditions then with some rain showers, maybe some more moderate temperatures, and those late season rains really helped us out on the double crop. So it's all about matching what we typically get as good conditions with the most critical times of that soybean plant. And for Oklahoma, the double crop, while it is riskier because we do plant it later and we typically have a shorter crop that does not have as long to develop, it also gets paired with typically some much more favorable conditions on that back end of the season.
Whenever you think of Oklahoma's climate, you may not think that it's suitable for crops outside of, say, a wheat or something that's drought hardy. Why does soybean seem to work so well in the state?
Well, I mean, we got a nice market for it, and then it fits within our system. And whenever you take a system-based approach or you look at things from a system-wide perspective, that's why that double crop system is so favorable for some of our folks, especially the ones that are getting out west to where they are getting into that area that would be considered fringe acres for soybean production. That double crop does work out best for them, and more often than not, that'll be the higher yielding system. But then whenever you take a look at Oklahoma in general, and we get to the eastern side of the state, so we're talking east of that Tulsa area, whenever we get closer to Missouri and into the Arkansas, those are very favorable conditions, and those producers typically have a lot more favorable conditions, not only for full season, but for double crop. Now, this year just wasn't the case because of how dry it was, but that's the part of the state that we really typically see our full season numbers spike up a lot, and is what we call our more traditional or the soybean production acres that are more historic. That's been the part of the state where we've seen a soybean for a much longer period of time. Some of our western, with better genetics, better cropping systems, no-till production, we've started to see more and more soybean to develop. So that's our new and developing region, and it really favors either some later full season or some double crop production.
Whenever it comes to soybeans this year, you mentioned the drought, but were there other issues facing this crop in the realm of disease or insect pressure?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, we had some insect problems here and there. If we take a look at some of our other summer crops, they had quite a bit of pest pressures. Some disease pressure kind of set in. Soybean actually didn't have that bad of an issue. We didn't see our major pest that we saw throughout the summer was chinch bugs and our corn and our sorghum system. Chinch bugs aren't as negative towards soybean. We have seen them be an issue really early in soybean systems to where the bugs just kind of overwhelm a small seedling. But once the soybean plant kind of gets up and starts developing, we don't see them as impactful as we do in corn, but especially grain sorghum systems. So we were relatively low on stink bug activity. We did have some across the state, but they were relatively low, pretty low on podworm. We did have some grasshoppers come in. I mean, a hot and dry year, we always talk about grasshoppers in Oklahoma, and we did get some foliar feeding, but we did have enough kind of pasture around that was being rehabilitated that a lot of times the grasshoppers stuck into that area. And so pest pressure was not nearly as bad as it could be or it has been in recent years. It's really that heat and the dryness that got to us this year.
We've seen that Bixby, Oklahoma is kind of your laboratory, for lack of a better word, for your research into soybeans. What are you working on there right now, and what other experiments are you working on across the state?
Yeah, so we typically have two kind of epicenters, if you will, to where we do a lot of research. Bixby is very similar to what we see in the eastern part of our state. So we have irrigation there, but we typically get much favorable moisture patterns, and the soils are coming off the river, and so they're very similar to what growers in the eastern side of the state have. We also have a big system over in Perkins, which is just down from Stillwater, that looks a lot more like our western production. So we typically try to pair things in those two systems to see how well a practice or a trial would do on the eastern side of the state as well as the western side of the state. And so we've had quite a bit throughout. Our big one that we got asked a lot of times this year, or a lot of times the last couple of years, is looking at PGRs. We've looked at these plant growth regulators, and if you think about plant growth regulators, soybean is probably not the crop you would think about using them on. You maybe think about cotton, you maybe think about some of your ornamentals, various other things, but the intent for that is that we typically get very nice Aprils and Mays with some good moisture, maybe some cooler temperatures. And when our full season growers plant that crop, they get very, very big, tall soybeans that got a lot of biomass to them. When July comes, that we don't have enough moisture to kind of sustain those larger systems, and that's where we start seeing yield loss kind of pop up and occur. And so we've been looking into mitigating some of that early season growth, or managing it a little bit better to shorten that crop up, very similar to what you would do in cotton. Make that internode length a little bit smaller, make it to where we don't put as much leaves on, maybe promote branching or root activity, and see if that helps out. And this year we found that it, we had a great year for it. It's very similar to what we would see, great April and May, and then it really turned off hot and dry in June or July and August. And we really saw some positive benefits from that. So whether that'll be economical, we haven't run the numbers yet, Dave, but is a nice little trial that we've done there. The other thing is, because we have such a diversity in our production systems, we've wanted to see how varieties respond to those. Being that a lot of our growers like branching soybean varieties because they think that helps mitigate against some of these stressors of the main stem. And so we've looked at a couple of varieties and really have seen a big difference in not only does soybean plant branch or not when put into these various conditions, but how much yield that it actually puts onto these branches is our mitigating factor. So it doesn't matter that they put on branches, it's the yield that goes onto that. So looking at that physiological differences between these different parts of the state and how a similar soybean variety responds across these very different production systems has been a big key for us. Now, Dave, one thing that we're starting to integrate into next year is I'm sure you're familiar, but maybe some of the listeners aren't, of this TAPS program. So it's a means to integrate grower input and grower activity onto some research trials, basically giving them a nice little playground that if they ever wanted to try something like a foliar fertilizer or really low plant populations, they can participate in this TAPS trial in soybean that we're going to have this next year. And they're going to be able to play around with some of the components and being able to see how that changes their production system to where they potentially would maybe integrate that into their field in coming years once they've seen how it actually plays out in the field. So really interesting to maybe bring that in. Nebraska kind of, I think, has been the start of a lot of that. In the Oklahoma, we've had that out in the Panhandle, and we're starting to bring that bigger question on more system-based and large-scale management of these crops, and let growers have that input on kind of what's going on and what's happening out in the field. So something to look forward to next year as we're kind of promoting that at end of this year.
That is one of the great things about a land-grant university. It is that integration between the university, but then also the producer who's using that information. But this is an opportunity for the producer to kind of work with the university in finding a better way to grow the crop.
Yeah, and like we said, one of the best things is them allowing them maybe that don't want to do on-farm research. So some of our growers like that on-farm research, and they can play around with inputs and practices that they want to on a small scale, but some of them are not as comfortable with it. And so we allow them to say, or, we tell them, hey, we're still going to do the research, but what do you want to do? What do you want to play around with? Is this, or is there a product that you've seen out there that you really want to try and manage it the way that the companies say, and really see if that product works? And you don't have to lose yield over it if it doesn't do well. We'll lose yield. That's fine, but we'll allow you to show you how it happens. The other great thing about that is it allows growers to see what other growers are trying and practicing. So it's not just what they do, right. It's what their neighbors and their partner does. And OSU is going to have a plot there, but it's just going to be our recommendations. So it would be how we would recommend growing a soybean plant. And you could say, hey, doing this actually added five or so bushels on what OSU recommends. So that could be a future recommendation or a change in practice that we would kind of look a little bit further into. So helps us get a little bit better cooperation with growers, and it allows some of those growers to have a larger hand in that research process.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Josh Lofton with Oklahoma State University, for going on with us and talking about the soybean crop across Oklahoma.
Oh, fantastic. Great to be here.